Well, it doesn't look like the Major League Baseball lockout is going to end anytime soon, and that stinks. But we have a grab bag episode. We're bringing in Josh Neighbors and Lauren Campbell from Locked On Nationals and Locked On Red Sox to talk about it. And I have a few thoughts along the way. This is Locked On MLB.
You are Locked On MLB. Your daily MLB podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans, and welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast, or we try to be daily podcasts. We cover all of Major League Baseball. Thanks so much for making us your first listen, as we're available on all your free podcasting platforms. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. This episode is being dropped on the second day of February 2022 with no end in sight of this lockout. Or who knows, maybe it'll be an end tomorrow. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like there's reasons to be optimistic because you hope that people aren't stupid. This show is available wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Locked On MLB Pod. Same handle for Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. So, there's not a lot to report. It's one of the frustrating things. You want to talk about, the trucks should be loading up now. You should be heading to spring training now. And the ripple effects of not having a season start doesn't just affect the owners. It doesn't just affect the players. It affects the people who work at the stadiums, all the ancillary businesses involved, the people who sell souvenirs, people whose businesses rely on it, people who work for Major League Baseball, people who work for the different teams, people who have parking lots, all these, it's a ripple effect. And it's not as simple as, well, it's millionaires and billionaires trying to carve up the pie. There's some things they're trying to solve, and there's definite issues that need to be fixed. But there comes a point where you say, hey, we need to come up with something. And based upon the stuff that is being said in the articles written, the Athletic article written by Ken Rosenthal was saying there's a $90 million gap between what the players and the owners want for some sort of a revenue sharing pool. It's pretty wide. The only thing that gives me any sense of potential optimism is the fact that they seem to be meeting every once in a while. You can't get anything accomplished if you're not meeting, but you got to come up with something soon. At some point you got to say there's a deadline. We need to get it done by this point. And you can't afford to lose any more games or anything. And think about some of the other things that would be affected by the season being delayed or disastrously if a season is skipped over, beyond. And we're going to talk a lot about this topic with Lauren Campbell and Josh Neighbors in the bulk of this podcast. But think about like how you're trying to figure out what to do with the A's, or trying to figure out what to do with the Rays. You've got to figure out what they're going to do with the stadium there. And if there's going to be no baseball season, or at least a season that's going to be truncated in a potential financial disaster, well, why would you invest in a big old baseball stadium there? Why would you invest in trying to fix those problems? And why would a city want to bring in a baseball team if the league is an unstable mess? I will say this, and I've said it before, and I'm going to probably mention it again when I bring Josh and Lauren on. None of the owners are hurting for money. That's nonsense when you hear owners are crying poor. That's just not happening. But even though I agree with the players on most of these issues, at some point you got to come up with a plan. At some point you got to come up with an agreement. At some point you got to come to grips with it. Because before you know it, it's going to be March. Things just can't happen with this isn't a community theater production where you're flipping on the lights of a local theater production. There's a lot of things that have to fall into place. A lot of people whose thinking about Amity Island and Jaws, the reason why they kept the beaches open, they need summer dollars. Well, a lot of people rely on summer dollars. So you got to come up with something pretty soon. I don't know exactly what it is, but at some point, there will be an agreement. Even in the scorched earth of 1994, 1995, an agreement was made. Eventually, baseball was played. And there was such a fever pitch of anger and hatred at that point. And the ball that started with the Curt Flood not reporting to the Philadelphia Phillies in 1969, the Catfish Hunter decision, and the Sykes decision, which started free agency in the mid-'70s. From that point, from 1975, when free agency bloomed, to the strike of 1994, there was a sense of inevitability that there was going to be an atomic explosion. Well, baseball has had labor peace since 1995. And that's been a good thing. And there's not been any games lost due to a labor strike. And so far, there still hasn't. But they have to come up with something. And the point I was making is that even at that point, when in that contentious environment, the owners and the players eventually came up with a absolutely wrathful, teeth-grinding agreement. You look back and say, why couldn't they have done that before? The concessions and everything, why couldn't those have been done in August of 1994? Think about how history could have been different. Now, books and articles have been written about, if this or that had happened in 1994, how baseball would have changed. But it's true. We might still have the Expos. The Yankees may have won the World Series with Buck Showalter as manager, and Joe Torre would never have sniffed the Hall of Fame. Who knows what the White Sox were a great team too. And the Indians were contending for the first time in generations. They went on to win the pennant the next year. You had a home run race, and was Matt Williams going to be the new home run king? Was Tony Gwynn going to bat 400? One of the great seasons in baseball history was cut short. How would things have been? And if you say, the Expos could have survived, just remember just a couple of years prior, the idea of the Giants staying in San Francisco was absurd. The idea of the Mariners staying in Seattle was absurd. So the idea of the Expos thriving in Montreal was not absurd. All these things could have happened. The entire history of baseball could have changed if they had just agreed to what they agreed to in spring training of 1995, in the middle of August of 1994. So think of it that way. You're going to come up with an agreement. So come up with it now. If there's going to be compromise, you're going to grind your teeth. Well, you're going to have that later. Doubling down doesn't make it any better. It's the lost, what is it? It's the fallacy of, what is that called? The lost cost fallacy. Well, I've already doubled down this much, so I can't leave it alone. No, you can. Actually, you really can. So just imagine that the clock is ticking, the door is coming down, and make that decision now. Because you can have a great season. And you can not lose any games. And you can all make piles of money. You can work it out. Just pretend it. And then at this point, not to quote Tina Turner, but I don't care who's wrong or right at this point. I think the players are predominantly right. I just want an agreement at this point. Let's get it done. And we talk about the state of baseball and everything, and the state of the lockout with Lauren Campbell and Josh Neighbors. It's part of an episode that I recorded this weekend, along with another edition of our game show, which I'll put on later. But I want to talk a little bit. There's no baseball being played right now, and there's not that much football is going to be played right now, except for a Super Bowl. But BetOnline BetOnline.net has way more stuff to bet on this playoff season. From scored, totals, players' performances, props, to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline is the number one spot for all things NFL betting in 2022. Not just football, betonline.net's basketball, hockey, boxing, UFC odds coverage is the best in the business. From sports right down to your favorite Las Vegas casino games, BetOnline is your number one online wagering destination. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports and play your favorite games. BetOnline is where the game starts. And we're going to talk a little bit about Built Bar. It's the new year, and so that means New Year's resolutions. If yours means getting fit or eating healthier, make sure you include Built Bar in your plan. Built Bar is a protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, maybe even better than a candy bar. And if you want to eat healthy, but you get bored by it, like you're saying, hey, this is not worth it. Where's the chocolate? Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, and most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 grams of net carb, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. There's so many great flavors to choose from: coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, salted caramel, mint brownie, and my favorite, which is raspberry, and many more. Built Bar is coming up with new limited time flavors. So check out built.com and see what's new. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off at built.com. Part of our grab bag episode that we're doing here, we have on Josh Neighbors from Locked On Nationals. We have Lauren Campbell from Locked On Red Sox. And I just want to ask you guys a couple of questions. What do you think the chances of us seeing a season starting, I don't know, anywhere near on time? And, what are your predictions of how this mess is just going to come to an end? Let's start with you, Lauren.
I am cautiously optimistic. I think that, I don't know if it says a lot about this communication. They've met a few times where it's like, hasn't lasted long, but I'm like, well, this is still kind of progress in some aspect. As for a season starting on time, I certainly don't think so. I'm thinking more probably mid-May, maybe even that's optimistic. But spring training is supposed to start in 2 weeks. Pitchers and catchers are supposed to report February 14th, and it doesn't look like I'm going to be very happy on Valentine's Day.
Yeah. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty embarrassing how these two sides operate. Like, they had all this time to start getting negotiations done, and when two sides are far apart, they need to have some kind of awareness of those differences to make sure you can actually meet the deadline. Thought Evan Drellich had a really good article a while ago talking about the NBA lockouts and how your best offers typically don't come until the very end of the process, right? Till the financial pressure is on one side or the other. And I think there's pressure on both sides. It's always more on the players because they have, less ability financially. They're not as well off as the ownership is, but the owners did take a big hit in the COVID season, right? It took a hit last year with lack of attendance in some teams for part of the season last season. I just don't know if you can keep taking hits. They can somewhat, but like some of these ownerships, they make a lot of their money. This is what it comes from. They don't own other companies or businesses. This is their business. And so I don't know how many of them are willing to take another hit with a season starting late. But that's where we're heading because these two sides are just really bad at getting in a room and figuring out their issues together.
I can tell you, as a billionaire, it's an interesting thing when we have all this money. I make several billions a year, mainly selling Built Bars here on Locked On MLB. By the way, if you haven't had a Built Bar, they're the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar. But that being said, I think that one thing that I have seen about billionaires is they don't like not making money. They don't like not having revenue coming in. And yeah, the COVID year of 2020, which I can't believe was 2 seasons ago, it was a disastrous punch to the face. And of course, attendance and everything, like a lot of the stadiums weren't even open to full capacity for most of the year last year. Not that is the lone metric of the success of a team. But I've been saying on this podcast that baseball is not competing with the NFL or NHL or NBA. They're competing with Netflix and YouTube and Hulu and Disney Plus as content. And I wish baseball would realize 2 things. That, first of all, they are content and they are the perfect sport for daily content and consumption on the internet. Because there's a game every day. And it's a game that could be you could easily process it by, you can't do hockey like following it on air. This Russian pass to this Swede, like it's too complicated to even follow it, like even on a Twitter feed. But a baseball game and everything, you can. And you can do a football game, but football isn't on every day. So baseball could be that thing, that wordle that we all engage in, that because it's a daily game. And also, I wish baseball, and this is going to sound like I'm making a joke, but I wish baseball would take a good, long, hard look at what Marvel did. Marvel embraced their geekdom, their fandom. When this all started, people barely knew, other than comic book geeks, barely knew who Iron Man and Thor were. And now they're like these, because they just dug into, okay, we're not going to care about if this tracks towards every demographic. We're going to make it so this core group goes nuts and creates a sense of community, and everyone wants to participate in that community. And we saw the only film in the last year and a half that became a box office sensation was the freaking Spider-Man movie, because people wanted to have that sense of community. And they didn't try to make it to please everybody. They dug into what the comic book nerds wanted. Well, there are baseball nerds. There are 3 of them currently on the screen right now. And instead of trying to say, oh, we're going to try to change this, we're going to try to change that, lean into what the baseball nerds want so everyone sees the enthusiasm for that and build upon that. Baseball has a lot deeper roots than Thor, the comic book character, not the Norse god. And I wish that baseball would understand that they have the capability of doing that and doing it but have the perfect format for it. And whatever piddly grab ass thing they're doing now, to figure out the midpoint at this point. I mean, I've always fallen in the favor of the players, but figure it out, because there's money to be made for everybody. That's my TED talk on this topic. But I do think that you have to embrace nerddom. That we saw that with Harry Potter. We saw that with the Lord of the freaking Rings.
But here's things. I mean, you don't even have to. Like, the one thing that you can do both. You can embrace the nerdom, and also you can you can do a better job of marketing your stars.
Yes,
and that's what's going to make you can do both, right? I mean, what are comic books ultimately built off of? The stars, right? The superheroes. They've got a few of them. They've got a bunch of them right now, and their responsibility is to put it out in the field. But the problem is they keep shooting themselves in the foot. Like, they really continually do this where they shoot themselves in the foot, and there's no good general PR for baseball. It just hasn't been. It normally does not happen. I mean, the conversation that we had last week was, it's about steroids, which was perceived as negative. And now the people that we want to get in the Hall of Fame didn't get in the Hall of Fame. Glad Ortiz got in, right? But the general conversation was negative about how Bonds and Clemens didn't get in. So they have a chance to generate some good press, come together, make something happen, and now market your stars, which they're horrible at.
Lauren, let me ask you a question. What was the first, and I'm not going to ask your age because a gentleman doesn't do that, but let me ask you, what is the first World Series that you remember, and the first real season of stars that you remember as a fan?
The first one I legitimately remember is when, I think, was it the Marlins beat the Yankees when Josh Beckett was on the mound?
Yeah, that was 03.
19-year-old Josh Beckett. I remember that vividly because 2003 was not good for me as a young Red Sox fan.
Right.
But that was the first one I legitimately remember.
Right. There's a reason I wanted to ask you that is because I'm a full generation ahead of you. So I do remember I remember when baseball players may have been marketed a little bit better, but you came of age and are a rabid baseball fan, and you didn't have the era of baseball that I grew up in, and yet you are almost the test case of what baseball should be looking at. Going, okay, what is it that grabbed you? What is it now? Of course, part of it was you're in New England, which is kind of a hotbed for baseball. But that being said, that was also Brady was king at that point. You could very easily have been, Patriots only and don't care about the Red Sox. So you remember at that period of time, was there any besides, I mean, obviously there was Pedro and Manny and Ortiz and Varitek and everyone on that Red Sox team, but what were the other stars that were there other stars that you remember at that time from other clubs that affected you, or was it just purely a regional fascination and also the Red Sox-Yankee rivalry?
A lot of it was the Red Sox-Yankee rivalry, but also I grew up in a time too when Braves games were always on national
Oh, that's
television.
true. Yeah, that's right. And the
So,
Braves were still good then. So
right.
yeah.
So, and then I learned a lot about like Chipper Jones growing up. Obviously, the Yankees, Derek Jeter, Mariano Rivera, Alex Rodriguez when he came to the Yankees.
Mhm.
And the Stars, it was Barry Bonds, Mark McGuire. I remember the steroid era, just like Mark McGuire smashing home run after home run, not having a neck, but me thinking like, 9-year-old me being like, oh, that's must be what all baseball players should look like. I don't know what steroids are at 9 years old or however old I was.
Yeah.
So a lot of that, but now there was no social media back then, which is
Right.
weird to say because we live off of it. And Josh said they need to be able to use the market to your players, market to your fans, because this is the perfect time to do it. Everyone is on Twitter, everyone's on
Yeah.
Instagram, and you have the opportunity to do this, and you can't for whatever reason. You just won't. Not that you can't, you won't.
I found it really odd that baseball has always had a contentious relationship with its own stars. Like the NBA realized uh, pretty much when Dr. J entered the league in the ABA NBA merger, but especially during Magic and Bird, and then perfected with Jordan, that it was based on stars. Even when you think about the NBA finals, you don't even necessarily think about it as this city versus that city. It's like this is LeBron versus Stephen Curry, or this is Michael versus Stockton and Malone. It was you almost have to like the it felt like LeBron James was in what 8 straight NBA finals, half of them with Miami and half of them with Cleveland. But you almost think of it as the same team because it's just
Right.
it has the same star. He just with Miami and Chicago. I don't think of that as the Miami represented there.
Right.
Much like I don't think of Jordan as Chicago. I think of him as his own star. Baseball, I have a weird theory that while the NBA was learning that, baseball was in the middle of the most nasty strike in the history of professional sports, of which there was so much owner-player contention, that they had players like Ken Griffey Jr. and Barry Bonds, skinny Barry Bonds, and Ricky Henderson and Kirby Puckett, and all these, massive Frank Thomas, all these people who could have been huge, huge stars. And they didn't market them because they didn't want to almost increase their value. And baseball, I think, has been paying for it as a generation didn't have that. And if they don't have the Red Sox, Yankees, or Cubs, they have no clue how to market some of these teams. And some of them, like the Braves, should have been a great feel-good story, that's I just think that that bitterness has led to the fact that they don't market the teams, and you could have a small market team in NBA or in football be a big sensation. Why do we only have Boston, New York, and Los Angeles and Chicago are the only cities we can market here? I demand answers.
I agree.
Same. I want answers too. I can't give them to you, but I can help you demand them.
Well, and I said I go back to the Marvel Comics thing because they were able to turn characters, the pretty deep bench of Marvel. Who heard of other than a comic book geek, who heard of Black Panther? 10 years ago. That was
Right.
a relatively obscure comic book. And it becomes this global phenomenon when it becomes a movie. Like people lining up around the block to see Captain America or whatever. I'm a little bit over, Marvel. I'm just I've been marveled out. But if you look up something like WandaVision becomes this big phenomenon, it doesn't have to be It's not like we need Spider-Man or the Hulk. Like, no, you can market that. That means they've tapped into something that I think baseball can too, which is a fun sense of community. People like community. That's why people like Wordle. It's something we're all doing together. That's why people all watch Tiger King. It's something we all enjoy together, or like maybe enjoy is the wrong term for Tiger King, but people enjoy that sense of enjoying with a community, and you have that with baseball. And why are they not? It's so built in. Just go with it. If we could get all hooked on Wordle, I think you can get people hooked on some of the stuff going on with baseball. It seems a lot easier to hook people on.
Sure seems that way. It should be that easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, the idea too that like with the way arbitration works is that teams have incentive to keep younger potentially star players down longer
Yeah.
for service time is a big
Yeah.
problem, right? Think about the big
Mhm.
stars we have: Tatis, Young; Soto, Young. Who's the kid from Tampa? Who's the Tampa kid? Totally blanking.
Rosarena,
No,
Wander
the other
Franco.
Wander Franco.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those guys are exceptions, but like there's some potential stars that there's not full incentive to bring them up as fast because of service time, and whatnot. So that kind of speaks to what we're talking about here about the star building.
Yeah. It drives me crazy because, I remember it drove me crazy in the early 90s because I was, rabid baseball fan then. And I didn't understand because I saw how there were okay basketball players who were household names, while Ken Griffey Jr. was having a hard time and Barry Bonds was having a hard time getting any national attention, while they were these elite, these absolutely, mind-bogglingly talented players. And I really think it came down to the petty squabbling between ownership and players, not wanting to build them up too much, and it led to a backlash. I think it may have led directly to. I mean, if you look at people talk about how there's a lack of African Americans playing in the game today. You look at the All Star lineups from the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. There are tremendous numbers of African American players, not just uh, players from the Caribbean, players of color from the Caribbean, but African American players, Rice and Winfield and Ozzie Smith and Kirby Puckett and Tony Gwynn and Dave Stewart, up and down the line, and you don't see that now. And I wonder how much that has to do also that when a entire generation of elite African American players were playing in baseball, like Gwynn and Thomas and Ken Griffey Jr. and Kirby Puckett and Ricky Henderson and Dave Stewart were all playing at the same time. All the marketing was done to, Jordan and Pippen and, Malone and David Robinson and Charles Barkley and all them and Shaquille O'Neal. I don't know. This is sociological stuff, but we're seeing the results of it, and we're seeing baseball hasn't really taken advantage of what they could have to skyrocket their popularity. My voice just broke.
Amen, brother. Amen.
Well, hey, by the way, just so you know, everyone, this was we just finished recording the game show that we posted on Monday, and we're all still hanging around. What you're listening right now is kind of the after show, which I wanted to play to you because I wanted to have I have Lauren and Josh on the show, and I figured, why, let's take advantage of that a little bit. So, hey, Lauren, I love your show. I love your previous podcast, and you had me on in your previous incarnation. And I remember when Gabrielle left, and the word got out, does anyone know a good Red Sox podcaster? And I said, you got to listen to Lauren Campbell, and I'm so glad that they did. I'm so happy that they brought you aboard because I love listening to your show because I love your point of view on the Red Sox, and it's terrific. And you're always welcome on our show. Tell people where they can listen to your podcast.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for all the kind words, and thank you for helping me get here because I'm certainly having a lot of fun doing this. You can find Locked On Red Sox wherever you get your podcast, and on YouTube. Just search Locked On Red Sox, and find us on Twitter at @LO_Red Sox.
What I love, by the way, about your show is while it is certainly, it's very similar to Stacey's Yankee show in that while you're definitely a Red Sox fan with deep-rooted Red Sox fandom love, it's not just going to be, it's not just homerism. Like if you have a problem with the team, you're going to mention it. You're going to praise the team when they do something right. You're going to criticize the team when they do something wrong. It's not just this provincial nonsense that you hear a lot of the time. And I think that makes it a breath of fresh air in the podcasting world. Josh, your podcast is terrible. You should be ashamed of yourself.
Fair.
No, you're doing a great job with their new host of Locked On Nationals. And I confess I've not listened to the Big 12 because I don't follow college sports, but I have listened to your show. You're doing a great job with Locked On Nationals. Tell people where they can listen to it.
You can find Locked On Nationals wherever you guys get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. You can find Locked On Big 12, those same places. Find me on Twitter at @JoshNeighbors_.
All right. Well, hey, this has been a lot of fun having you guys been on here for a bit and cracked out a couple episodes for this week. Thanks so much for being part of the show. You can follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter. Same handle for Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Check out also Locked On Bets with your boy Q and expert analysis from Lee Sterling. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. We're available on all your free podcasting platforms. Talking about the state of baseball in an impromptu episode with Lauren Campbell and Josh Neighbors. This is Locked On MLB. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.